So let's just jump right into it, Samo. What is the motivation behind this theory? What are you trying to explain and account for that other theories can't account for?
Thank you for having me on the show. First, it's a pleasure to join you. The goal with this theory was to sort of propose a mechanism for this creation and introduction of various new social technologies that seem to define entire civilizations, and also to account for the role of human agency in history. Why do we seem to see some individuals, some societies that counterfactually seem pretty unlikely, right? There are unique features for almost every civilization, every society you might encounter. And there seem to be certain individuals that are at the right place at the right time and end up being catalysts for these vast institutional changes.
Right. So as you're aware, there's an alternative theory that, it's cultural evolution, it's memes, or it's market competition, and the people just happen to be in the right place at the right time. But these forces are either, they're like great forces, or they're just like randomness or sort of natural selection in the idea space that's motivating these changes. What makes you think that the individuals are causally responsible rather than just along for the ride?
Would you say these forces and trends can be understood and studied explicitly?
Yes.
If they can be studied, and if they can be intentionally impacted, then of course we are back to the causality with the individuals acting on the basis of these historical theories. I think an excellent example of this might be Vladimir Lenin, where to a great extent, he's just taking Marxist economics, which, probably isn't quite right, but has some predictive things to say. And he's trying to apply it to the process of accelerating a revolution. Now, whether or not this theory is any good at predicting global economic development, Marxism-Leninism has a solid track record of revolutionary activity. So as soon as you come to study society, either implicitly or explicitly, and if it is intelligible, then it sort of brings it back to particular individuals that leverage this knowledge and come to transform society. Now, I'm not going to claim anything like free will for the individuals. I think probably at the end of the day, they're still a product of, all of these same physical laws that seem to determine everything else in our universe. But the individual, I think, represents a useful event horizon, right? It is very difficult to work out how exactly an individual was shaped by society, but it is much easier to figure out how an individual shaped society back. So it seems an epistemically better place to try to, untangle this catch-22.
Sure. Okay, that's interesting. But so you might disagree with this. It seems to me that there's certain social technologies that are clearly shaped by cultural evolution. You can include examples like the English language or English common law or like the city of Mumbai or Hinduism. There's important figures in, these technologies. You could say like Shakespeare shaped a lot of English language, for example. But these seem particularly to be the compound effects of many individuals across multiple centuries. And so I grant you that there may be other social technologies that are the product of a single human mind. How do you figure out which kinds of social technologies are the result of more evolutionary pressures versus the agency of an individual?
I would tend to say anything that has a clearly definable first exemplar, a first clear origin, and where the jump in complexity is very rapid, happens over 10, 20, 30 years, essentially the span of a single lifetime, maybe at most 50 years, let's say, a teacher and an apprentice. I think the case is pretty strong there specifically. So, for example, when we look at the Prussian general staff system, of course, it's a product of long cultural evolution with the aristocratic class in Prussia, this is called Junker class, the older aristocrats, the sort of legacy of the Teutonic Knights, right, that are basically the predecessors of the Prussian state, and all of this stuff. Yet so much of it can be traced back to the way Napoleon organized his general staff and how various people in Germany studied intently the way Napoleon interacted with his lieutenants when making strategic and tactical decisions. To great effect, by the way. There have been statistical analyses of the success of Napoleon compared to other commanders of his time period. And it's been shown that he had like a very outsized impact in this regard. Now, I wouldn't say Napoleon is a great founder, even if we acknowledge these necessarily a great historical figure, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that the Prussian general staff system is pretty much a direct consequence of Napoleon's system of management of military intelligence resources and commanders and all of that. And further, if I were to try to make a case that Napoleon is a great founder type, I would note his codification of French law that was exported to the rest of the continent, where it basically supplanted the older, much more locally diverse Roman tradition of law. It, of course, built upon it, but it was a great reform in its own right, like the greatest since Justinian 1,200 years ago. And honestly, that legacy, that legal legacy, might still be with Europe in 1,000 years or in 500 years. These things have deep roots once established.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, there's evidence that the Napoleonic law codes, the countries experienced faster growth rates for a long time after they were instituted. Now, I'm curious why you would be tempted to say that he's not a great founder. He seems like one of the examples in history of the greatest examples in history of a great founder type.
I think it's too early to tell. I think we'll see whether, in fact, he managed to create a whole new civilization or whether this was a more modest addition. I think often it takes a few centuries to sort of figure out, well, which of these innovations are truly exceptional? Now, of course, is this a selection effect? I think obviously it is, right? There are people who strive to transform their societies and they end up impacting a relatively marginal institution. And there are those who end up impacting the most relevant, the most important institutions. And it's not always clear beforehand which is which. All else equal, I'm going to say that Napoleon is a strong example of someone shaping history intentionally, right? And in a quite self-aware way. You can read his diary entries, right? Where if you go read these sources, it's really interesting where he's writing in his diary how people, when they cheer Napoleon, they're not cheering him, the person, they're cheering their image of him, of right, how they've created a mythological figure out of him. And what can he possibly do but go along with this and work with this? And hasn't this been the destiny of all great people? And you might think, okay, Napoleon, you're full of yourself, but is megalomania even unjustified when you're kind of right? It's sort of like when Alexander the Great thinks of himself as a Greek demigod. Is he even wrong? Like if you compare his feats to the mythical feats of Hercules, they kind of start to be in the same ballpark, right? It's not a Judeo-Christian god, but it's something.
Yeah, and my favorite example of this is when Churchill was in high school. He wrote an essay where he said, London is going to be under attack, and I'm going to be the man that saves it. And this, so like he basically predicted the Blitz. Yeah. It's like if you're a conspiracy theorist, you would think that he had something planned in high school. So maybe, I mean, not only did he save London, he probably saved civilization itself, right? So in fact, what seemed like a kid who was too full of himself, like actually he was underestimating himself, which I always find interesting. Okay, so a lot of interesting questions from the comments you just made. Since your theory places so much emphasis on the individual and the decisions the individual makes, doesn't that mean you're basically saying your theory can't predict much because humans can choose different things, right? And that's part of your theory.
Well, I think the future is not set in stone, and it is up to the decisions of many people around the world. And I think that so many political, social, and cultural gambits rest on trying to convince everyone of self-fulfilling prophecy. I partially see my role as trying to sabotage some self-fulfilling prophecies, right? I see my role as deconstraining the future insofar as I can in my own modest way. So I would say, yeah, definitely. There are many theories that place a limit to knowledge, right? Often, sort of the first step in science, the most elementary statement you can make is, I don't know. Now, having said all of this, having said that I don't think we can easily predict the world 500 years from now, like, say, the fictional Harry Seldon could in Isaac Asimov's Foundation books, I do think that once you identify sort of a founder type, like someone that is creating new institutions, someone that is a live player, to use my terminology, live player meaning someone that's not playing off of a script, but sort of creatively changing and breaking the mold, breaking the reference class over and over and over again. I think at that point, you can predict that that person is going to have successes unless counterbalanced by a different live player. So I think really if you have someone that's a live player and they're at the helm of a powerful institution, the only thing that can really beat them is sort of another live player, right? I think they're just so overpowered compared to most social processes precisely because of their adaptability. Now, it's now, when I first wrote these essays a few years ago, I thought of various political and economic figures. I used the example of Elon Musk. Now I don't use the example of Elon Musk because it's too obvious. Everyone already knows that he breaks the mold. But I feel that back in 2014, 15, you needed something like my theory. There are many different theories that would propose it, but I did make the right bet.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think I probably fell into the same fallacy when I was reading it. It just didn't occur to me that actually this was written a long time ago, and so the Elon Musk thing was actually
Less
a great.
obvious.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I want to get a sense of how many live players you think there are in society. So if you think, for example, that even for somebody like Napoleon, we can't yet conclude that he's a great founder. Is a great
We
founder
can
somebody
certainly
who comes
conclude
along?
he's a live player, but we'll see how big
Okay,
the
I
French,
see.
how well does French civilization, European civilization do? I think that's unclear, right? It might be on a decline trajectory. It might yet have great revival and so on. But please,
But
you
so how many? Is there a way we can estimate the amount of live players just so I can get an understanding of
mhm.
like how constrained you think this group is? Would it be like most companies in the Fortune 400, 500, or is it like a very few amount of people in the entire world?
Much narrower. I think you can be an excellent CEO and basically not be a live player. In fact, this is the point of many management theory books. Like there are actually, there's one book I would recommend on this. It is a book called Leading Change by John P. Cotter. He's Harvard MBA professor, and sorry, business management theorist. And he notes that actually most CEOs today are selected to be risk averse, and that if you have a company that works well, this is actually a great place to start. But if you're trying to produce something new, some innovative new product, then you're actually in quite a bit of trouble uh, with that kind of human capital. And honestly, most of society, we shouldn't be necessarily gambling with it. But as sectors like venture capital and so on demonstrate, there is great, there are important returns to be had from making these bets that are low probability but very high impact, right? These bets end up being so important for driving progress. And I think it applies not just in technology or software, it also applies to social change, to religious change, to political change, and so on. Okay, to give you an actual estimate, I think today, if I had to guess, I would say between like 500 to 1,000 live players. I don't think this is in the millions. I think most of us, including myself, were just very much playing off of scripts because for the most part, like the safest strategy is to imitate and incrementally improve on what everyone else is doing. It's much harder to sort of derive things from first principles or some sort of almost lucky intuition or hard to explain intuition. I think there's definitely unaccounted for genius, right? For example, whatever one thinks of Donald Trump, it's hard to deny he was a rhetorical genius and that on the fly he would come up with these strange formulations and both on Twitter and verbally during speeches. I think there are not many politicians like him. Now, I would say that perhaps Obama was an interesting live player. No one was expecting him to win the Democratic nomination. But again, he was very different than Trump. And again, he kind of stood above everyone else, right? There wasn't someone that was almost an Obama competing with Obama, in my opinion, right? So if you look at that in the domain of politics, in the domain of business, in the domain of science, of culture, you add these people up together. And I think that's, 500 to 1,000 is about right. How many great founders have there been historically? I sort of feel that if I were to go through the history of Western civilization, we would come up with about 10 or maybe 12 people. If we look at Chinese civilization and its various waves, I actually wrote an article on Late Zhao China where I talk this through. I think you'd also see about 10 to 12. So I think that, throughout, let's say, the recorded part of human history, there have been about 1 to 200 great founders.
Okay.
So that's why Napoleon might not pass the bar. I would be inclined to say he does, but I think it's actually very important to evaluate him in the context of people like, Muhammad, right? And, Charlemagne and so on.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that quote by, I forget the name of the historian, but he's asked, what do you think of the French Revolution? And he says, it's too early to tell. Okay, so I wonder what you think of my contention that actually the market is dominated by many live players that are pretty impressive, especially the biggest firms are very innovative. You think of, for example, the bets that Facebook is making in the metaverse. You think of the bets that Elon is making in so many different places. You think about, Google betting on AI and so on. Would you agree with me that the market is full of these live players? They dominate most of the resources in the market. And in fact, this is what you would expect given the incentives and the evolutionary pressures of the market?
I would say that I would cautiously agree with the example of, say, Elon. I would also raise, Jeff Bezos. Like, for example, I'm much more bullish on Blue Origin, even though on paper it doesn't look very good, because it's sort of the same man as putting attention into it as was there with the creation of Amazon back in the day. I'm more skeptical of Google's AI efforts. I think, of course, they've been sort of in the AI business nominally for a while now. I think the metaverse it's interesting in a way. It's perhaps driven by Zuckerberg. I'm not yet convinced it's going to actually work out. But these are all sorts of object level, arguments. I think the very biggest companies and some of the very smartest investors are often live players, but I don't think they're dominated, right? Let's look at Aramco, right? It's $1 trillion company. I don't think it's a live player. It's like a very formidable player, right? But Saudi Arabia's, oil company, the former Arab American oil company, very dominant, very big, but definitely this sort of glacial incumbent, right? We often, especially if we follow tech, feel the rest of the economy is as dynamic as tech is, right? Where winners and losers change so rapidly. But really, that's not the case, right?
Oh, sorry, what's not the case?
It's not the case that the winners and losers actually churn that quickly, right? If you look at the biggest giants, like these are companies that have been around for a really long time. Say, I'd be open to the argument that, say, Blackstone, for example, is an asset management firm that's like a live player, but that's a 40-year-old live player. It's been around for 40 years, right?
Yeah.
So you see these patterns. Or, for example, who are the giants of philanthropy? Well, it's the Gates Foundation. Well, okay, why the Gates Foundation? Why not the Zuckerberg Chan Foundation, or whatever it's called? I think it's because Gates, for whatever reason, was just better at the relevant maneuvering and was first, and got other people to sign the Giving Pledge and so on.
Yep. Interesting. On a slight tangent, now that we brought up Blackstone, I really enjoyed the analysis you did of Blackstone on your newsletter. I'm curious if you think that Blackstone's strategy, or it might not even be a strategy, it might just be an accident of the CEO donating to Republicans, but then Blackstone affiliated employees and groups are donating to the Democrats. Is this smart in that they have both sides in their pocket, or is this dumb in that they're canceling out each other's contributions?
Well, first, I'm just going to take an opportunity to promote the Bismarck Brief, which is
Please
a
do.
intelligence grade newsletter released every Wednesday, 7 a.m. Pacific time. We look into a company like Blackstone or into interesting phenomena like what's happening with Jack Ma this week and how did the conflict between Jack Ma and Xi's China work out. There's an in-depth case study every week, 20 pages of material researched, intended to cut through the noise and just get to the signal. And all of it is done sort of with these institutional analysis tools that me and my team have developed over the last decade. But to talk about Blackstone, I think it's absolutely brilliant. I think politics is the art of superimposing sources of legitimacy that should cancel each other out, right? I think, for example, modern states can claim many different sources of legitimacy. Say, if you took someone in the United States who is more Republican leaning, they might ground the authority of the American state, the federal government, in the Constitution and say it's legitimate as long as it's following the Constitution. This isn't a democracy, this is a constitutional republic. Meanwhile, if you took someone on the Democratic side, they would say, in a democracy, in a liberal democracy, the rights of individuals are respected. Elections cannot be tampered with. Elections have to be respected. The authority comes directly from the people. And in an interesting way, it's fascinating to me that the modern United States actually has a striking parallel with the Roman Republic, right? The Roman formula was the Senate and people of Rome, right? That's where the SPQR comes from. Like, that acronym means that the authority comes from the Senate of Rome and the people of Rome, and these are sort of separate entities. And I think it's very interesting that you can have this superposition, but the end effect is that despite their ideological differences, most, center left and center right people in the United States agree on the legitimacy of the United States government. So fun. You should try to always position yourself so that different ideological and political groups have different reasons for believing you're legitimate and doing a good job. And, I'll give another example. Have you noticed how Elon Musk, say, went from being basically Democrat affiliated and Democrat supported to basically Republican affiliated and Republican supported, and nothing about his business has really changed? Like, if you think back to the Obama era, the sort of green energy bill, where he's sort of the darling that's solving global warming. And now he's the rebel who moved from California to Texas because of lower taxes and is, tweeting nasty things and so on, right? This is quite a rebrand with no fundamental business change. So there are two ways you can do this, right? The first one is the Blackstone strategy, two things simultaneously. And the other way to draw from multiple sources of legitimacy and multiple allies is to rebrand yourself when the time arrives, which I think is what Elon did.
That's interesting. I thought it was actually kind of a mistake because the government in charge is run by Democrats, but actually you put a nice spin to it. And then, there's two more interesting examples here. Napoleon himself, the biography Andrew Roberts wrote about him, he mentions how, the Jacobins thought that, actually Napoleon's with us. He just has to, do a few things for the other guys, but, really his heart is with us. And, the moderates thought the same thing. The liberals thought the same thing. The religious conservatives thought the same thing. Actually they say of Bill Clinton, that he's the kind of guy that can walk into a room, talk to 25 different people and leave each one of those people thinking that he actually agrees with me. He just told the other guys some lies. Okay. So, I'm glad you brought up, the Bismarck Analysis brief. I actually have a question from Maxwell Tabarrok on Twitter. He says, I'd like to know more about Bismarck Analysis. How did he start it? What did he know about the market before he started it? And who is their product intended for? And just to give some context, Max is a friend. He's in college right now and he has a blog. I think he aspires to become an economist. So I think he's probably trying to learn how you do become an intellectual whose ideas and thoughts are valued by the market.
Yeah, I view my intellectual career, in a way as separate, but in another way as intimately connected to the company Bismarck Analysis, right? Basically, it seemed to me very clear that the vast majority of interesting stuff happens on the inside of organizations, on the inside of elite networks, not necessarily on the outside. And I wanted an opportunity to both participate in many different types of institutions. That's a problem. Today, we have a really specialized economy, rightfully so. Is there a specialty that could allow you to touch many different domains, learn from all of them, gather that information, acquire firsthand experience? And, the option of consulting came up fairly quickly. I was fortunate enough to be relatively well networked in Silicon Valley. I also noted that there was a missing niche when it came to working with, ultra high net worth individuals and high net worth individuals. Their financial investments were well taken care of with basically family offices covering almost all aspects. But when it came to their personal strategy, there was an opening. They often would just have to talk to people they almost handpicked like courtiers, like this was like Florentine Italy or something. And I looked at that and I felt that was so inefficient that there must be a niche. I could not do much more market research because it was such an underdeveloped market, but it turned out to be the right bet. So we work with, technology entrepreneurs, people who had worked in finance. We help figure out the institutional aspects of their strategies. We often will look at companies like Aramco or at the regulatory agencies in Switzerland or the United Kingdom or whatever. Sometimes the goals will still be economic and financial. Other times they might be, say, philanthropic. We did, for example, work on figuring out what a private individual could do to encourage and bring about an international arms control treaty aimed at artificial intelligence and weapons using artificial intelligence, right? Our client was convinced that this is going to be as bad or worse than nuclear weapons, and that, something like a landmine ban should be made. And then, if you're a tech billionaire, it's not really obvious who you hire or how you would hire them or how you would go about trying to push an international treaty, trying to achieve it. So we did some case studies on this, some research. It turned out there were actually some Swedish industrialists that had, because of the country's neutrality, been able to greatly contribute to the start of the nuclear disarmament negotiations in the 1970s. And, that's not an obvious thing. That's not something that is easy to find. So I have just delighted in this work. And here's where maybe the connection comes back. I do think you have to impress people. I think when you come into a room, it's not hard to get a meeting with some of the most interesting, intelligent, or wealthy people in the world. It's much harder to have something worth saying. So you might get a 30 minutes meeting, but that's going to be your last 30-minute meeting if you don't say something very useful or very interesting, something to grab attention. So I think being, let's say being well-read, having thought about society a lot, I had always a unique angle, a unique advantage to offer. So say something that was plausibly true, or they could even confirm was true, and they'd never heard before. And I think that really, really helped the initial client acquisition. Now,
Right.
The Bismarck brief that I mentioned is our attempt to democratize it, right? It's still a pretty, objectively speaking, a pretty expensive subscription service. But my goal was to offer, for an audience of hundreds or thousands of people, briefs of the quality that usually billionaires afford. And for now, it seems to be working out. We're 2 months in, but very happy with this additional object, with this additional product.
Yeah. I'm wondering, by the way, how do you make sure, if you're an entrepreneur or if you work in the private sector, you have incentives that make sure that you're focusing on the right problem, that you're not getting distracted, or that the solutions you're coming up with are actually practical and helpful. How do you manufacture the same set of incentives for somebody who's an intellectual, who might be a consultant, for example? Do you think that you have been able to stay on track here? And if so, what's been your strategy?
Well, I think a big part of my strategy to sort of, I honestly have turned down clients when I thought they would not accept the answer that I believed they were wrong. I think that, there's, of course, some money left on the table. It's not quite profit maximizing to do this, but I think it's very important for sort of a long-term edge, a long-term advantage. No matter what I do, I'm never going to be as well networked as the company, like a company like McKinsey. Even if I hire brilliant people from McKinsey, or excellent people who've worked at Yale before and so on, and we've done so. It's just complete difference. It's like an elephant and a little fly. You have to have a differential. And my hope is to develop these very long-term client relationships where what I have to say, you might not always like it, but a few years down the line, you'll remember that perhaps I was the only person in your circle who told you that. The selection for yes men and the distortion for information traveling up company hierarchies, absolutely brutal. It's also brutal, unfortunately, in the consulting market. If you read people who have been sort of dissatisfied with the consulting industry, they'll note that often consulting firms are brought into companies to advocate for things that the leadership already wants, that the leadership of the company say, they want to cut staff by 30%, they want to do layoffs. So they'll basically hire the consulting firm to be the bad guy, to be blamed for the decisions they want to make. That doesn't leave a lot of intellectual freedom, right? But, talking to an individual who wants accurate information, who just wants a good navigation grade map for their decision-making, often, They're very intellectually open. So I delight with the opportunity also to work with individuals rather than committees. My experiences over the years have been that you can tell an individual they're wrong and they might still listen to you. They might renew your contract come end of year, renew your retainer. But if you tell to a committee, however, you have to always tell them they're right, even when they disagree with each other. Right. So it's a big problem, right? On a committee, you can never be quite sure who are your friends, who are your allies, who is your real client. You often don't even know who on the committee advocated for your contract. And like that's a very important piece of information just from a salesman perspective, right?
Yeah. Okay. Now I think I want to ask you about the great founders themselves. So I want to learn why do some people become great founders and others don't? Everybody says they want to have an impact, right? Very few people do. Well, for example, Peter Thiel claims that the thing that distinguishes great founders from others is they exemplify the opposite ends of many traits. I'm wondering, do you agree with this characterization? Do you have have you noticed some patterns in the people who tend to have a lot of influence, in the live players, and so on?
I think one very important point is that people who end up being exceptional founders, they are people who can socially conform if they choose to, but are capable of not conforming even when everyone tells them they're wrong. This sounds so basic, but if you think about it, for the most part, if you read social psychology or behavioral economics or anything like that, you realize that we're much more conformist creatures than we would like to admit. I think there's a nicer way to say it. We're extremely social creatures. Our feelings are hurt when someone says something bad to us, right? Like, I don't know, since you're active on Twitter, you know how hurtful a nasty Twitter comment can be, even though objectively it doesn't matter, right? Objectively, it doesn't matter. But I think it's very hard to escape these social intuitions. So who are the people who escape these social intuitions? Well, often, they might just be antisocial. Unfortunately, though, or maybe fortunately, that sort of antisociality produces a really strong ceiling on where you could go, right? Like whatever one thinks of Bill Clinton, he is empathic because he is able to tell what people are feeling, right? He can feel with them. Now, you might say he is empathic and manipulative, but note how different that is from just being clueless about what others think or completely disregarding or not caring what others think. So I think often there is a persuasive ability, a charisma. There is a special source of knowledge. There's something that they believe they know that no one else does, that in their own mind justifies them to action, right? They might even conceive of it as divine inspiration. Like a lot of the historical founders believe they were inspired by gods or God. It might be like a belief in scientific knowledge. It might be belief in their own personal brilliance, as was in the case of Napoleon. And so a lot of things can provide that legitimacy from which they act so that they don't get demoralized. And at first, they will often have long periods of demoralization. Now, you mentioned, say, Winston Churchill, right? And of course, you probably the part of his career where the Gallipoli invasion is an absolute disaster, and it seems like his political career is over forever. I think if he was more socially, not just attuned, but conforming, he would just go and switch careers at that point. He would never go back into politics and never have this opportunity to do something again.
Yeah. He did. I guess he just switched cards slightly and he became a writer for a little while, but got back into parliament as soon as he could. By the way, when you bring up, I'm active on my Twitter, so I must know what hate messages feel like. I can honestly say that I'm so little popular on Twitter that I've never received any negative comment whatsoever. The worst I received was when somebody said, "Your timestamps are not synchronized with the episode." So that's about as bad as it has gone for me so far.
I have to say the vast majority of my followers are excellent. I'm very grateful that at 27,000 or 26,000 followers, I still delight for most of the replies I receive. And especially I note this includes people who disagree in good faith, because those I feel are so important for intellectual progress. I've seen too many echo chambers in my life to not appreciate constructive disagreement, right? And private DMs and emails, that's a different matter. People start making weird conspiracy theories about you. Sometimes just somewhat unstable people email you. And, the only real thing to do then is delete and block, and that's it. And you move on with your day. It's not really worth getting into details, but, there's more than one way to say acquire stalkers or whatever, right? And you don't want that. You really don't.
Yeah, definitely. In a recent episode of his podcast, Tyler Cowen said that the thing that distinguishes the millionaires and the billionaires he knows is their level of perseverance. I wonder, what have you noticed? What distinguishes a live player from a great founder? Obviously, other than the fact that great founders have a lot of impact, but why do they have a lot of impact many generations down? What makes a live player a great founder?
Well, I think many live players are actually just interested in optimizing the world here and now. And many great founders feel that it is their calling to impact society, right? You can, of course, impact society profoundly without having any such aspirations. But, this desire to really reform, refound, or fix a big important aspect of your society, I think that's a pretty unique calling, right? That's a pretty unique ambition. There are many people who sort of LARP it, who take it on themselves as kind of an attire, but they're not going to make many choices, right? They're gonna mostly make choices that end up perhaps profit maximizing or popularity maximizing, or some simpler goal like this, something less elevated. Often the very best way to have a big impact is not to add yourself to one team or another that each is pulling a rope in their own direction. The best thing to do is to pull the rope sideways, right? But very few people are motivated to pull the rope sideways. So if I were to say, if I were to succinctly really drill into this, perhaps what I would really say there is something like a desire to found something, to create something that outlasts you, right? And this can be out of a relatively narcissistic motivation. It can be out of a desire for a legacy that endures the centuries, a desire to beat Ozymandias, right? Ozymandias, king of kings, and all that remains of this great monument of this pharaoh, or, the broken feet. Arguably, Julius Caesar has this motivation, maybe even Alexander the Great, right? Julius Caesar, there's the famous episode where he's weeping when he's 30 years old and visits the statue of Alexander the Great. He weeps that Alexander the Great conquered the known world, and Julius Caesar has done nothing. And he kind of makes up for it by the time he's 50. Now he's at least as well known as Alexander the Great, many thousands of years later. So that type of motivation, it can work. And the other type is often it's more of an altruistic calling, right? It's a desire that, there's something deeply injured about the human condition, and it needs repair or reform. And I think many people who today we would term as prophets or social reformers, they often come out of this position.
Interesting.
And out of this motivation. And of course, that can also be perverted and can obviously cause immense suffering and destruction, but it orients the person towards the distant future and the deep future.
Interesting. So that must mean that, do you disagree with the Lord Acton quote that great men are almost always bad men, if there's an element of altruism to their actions?
Well, I think it's perfectly possible to be a bad man with a big dose of altruism. I think great people, both bad and good, they're complex, they're multifaceted. Like, for example, I guarantee you that there are many aspects of Abraham Lincoln's personality that modern Americans would find annoying or unsavory. And, the same can obviously be said of Churchill. And there are many aspects that people might find admirable, even in history's villains, right? A Genghis Khan, right? For example, there might be things that people would find admirable if they could know the person, not just the historical effect. So I really do think that we shouldn't forget that, perverse outcomes can also play an important role, right? Someone might have the best intentions, but what is it? The road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yep. I want to bring us back to social technology. You claim that social technology, determines the material technologies in a civilization. I'm curious why you think the centralized internet is inevitable if social technology is the background here. There's many different societies, they have different social technologies. why is it the case that they will all gravitate towards the same material technology?
I basically think that it is possible to construct a more decentralized internet, but it would require very different social technologies than the ones we are currently using. I feel the Western world pretends to have a free internet, but what we actually have is this archaic 1990s internet that is one step at a time, every few years, getting closer and closer to the Chinese vision of the internet. In other words, China is already living in the future. We don't like China, but we mostly just talk about, well, we negotiate how fast does our internet have to be like China? How are we going to collect all of this data without violating people's privacy? Well, the answer is, well, we're going to first collect it more slowly, and then eventually we're going to collect all the same thing China collects, right? And maybe we're going to produce some barriers between, companies and government that don't exist in China. But then the companies will start to have a great role in how elections go, and then they're going to have an influence over government, and then companies and government are merged again, except from the other end. We don't yet have a good answer. I think I would say that in the absence of invention, social technology invention, not just material invention, the internet has been a centralizing force and will continue to be so. I honestly think this is even true of the so-called Web3 trend, which has sort of started being relevant in the years since I wrote this article. I think over the last 2 years, because if you think about it, something like a publicly readable ledger of all transactions. Now, that doesn't sound very decentralized. Maybe the implementation is, but by default, it's actually increasing the transparency of financial transactions compared to something like cash.
Yeah. I guess maybe it's important to make a distinction between legibility and decentralization. Something can be
sure, but it's easy to make the case that increases in legibility by default lead to more centralization, right? You Seeing Like a State is like another excellent book I would recommend, and the argument there is that if you make something legible, unless you've done something else in addition to making it legible, you are in fact aiding central planning, and that's what's going to happen, or at least the pressure will be towards there, and the economic and political rewards will be for such centralization, for such economies of scale.
Interesting. Okay, let's talk about civilizational collapse next. I view that as another great theme of your work. When I look, I find your analysis of past civilizations very interesting, and especially when you claim that civilization is older than we think. But when I look at modern civilization, it seems to me that many of the failure, the potential fragilities of past civilizations, frankly, we just don't have. Like, we're so much wealthier and we have so much more technology that, small disasters or big disasters, there's a greater stock they have to evaporate before we're down to the level of famine and destruction. And we have a global civilization. Our technologies are distributed around the world. There's factories all around for all kinds of things. If one society goes down for some reason, the other ones the knowledge remains around the world to restart civilization. And there's nothing like the Library of Alexandria anymore, where if you burn it down, we've decimated the stock of human knowledge. Even tacit knowledge through YouTube, as you've explained, we have stocks of tacit knowledge on the internet. Not to mention explicit knowledge that's obviously we have loads and loads of backups of. So I'm curious, can you convince me that the evidence of civilizational collapse in the past is applicable to our world today?
First off, I'm going to say there are in fact problems we have outgrown. If there's a particularly bad drought on the Nile River, this will not collapse our civilization. I would agree with that. However, I'm going to note on what an inhuman scale nature operates. When you look at the universe, and when you look at something like a supernova explosion, or even something much smaller, like many orders of magnitude less energy intensive, like an asteroid hit, I think you can agree that an event like that could easily wipe out our technological civilization. Like, for example, a very strong solar flare could easily fry all of the planet's electronics. These aren't even flares that happen once a million years. For as best as we can tell, this is just something that happens every few thousand years. We might not get unlucky, but then the ancient Egyptians might not have gotten unlucky. They might have had a few centuries of, good floods and so on, right? So I want to say that we have outgrown many problems caused by our environment. but not all of them. Currently, I think there's a live debate within our society whether global warming is a man-made problem that is a severe enough natural or man-made natural disaster that it might be a threat to our society. I would actually tend to say that we're probably going to adapt to it fairly well. But again, I think it is easy. There's a strong case to be made that it might be very hard for us to adapt to it well, you know? So that's my first argument. The second argument is, I feel you made the case that we are a single globalized society, and then you immediately went and said, and if there's a failure of one society, there are plenty of other societies around the world. Well, which is it? If we are a globalized society, all of my chips, everything in my phone, my iPhone, Android, doesn't matter. It's all built in Taiwan. And if it's not all built in Taiwan, it's all built in China. And if the US experiences an economic collapse, the profits of those factories, they fall down through the floor, right? And if there's a great war between the United States and China, a nuclear war that targets centers of production, tell me, when are we going to be back to building CPUs like we do in 2022? It might be decades. It might be a century. I, by the way, don't think nuclear war wipes out humanity, but that it wipes out enough industrial centers that we have to go low tech for a while, and that the EMP stuff wipes out the internet, I think that's quite plausible. So that leads me to the third argument, right? So the second argument was, if we're a globalized society, it's not that we are correcting for each other's fragility. We are compounding each other's fragility because we are not independent, many different civilizations, each in their own container, but interdependent. And then the third argument that I'm touching on with the nuclear war argument is the argument that with great wealth and great technological power, conflicts, wars, both internal and external, can become very destructive. Maybe there is no way to, let's remember the Library of Alexandria died in 2 steps. The first step is when the Romans conquer it, it loses its main source of funding, the Ptolemaic dynasty. The second step is much later when it's burned down. Both of these are the result of political conflict. No one's going to necessarily burn down the internet, but would you be really shocked if cyber warfare got so bad that during the course of a serious war between great powers or even middle powers, a virus was unleashed that had a specific purpose of destroying every copy of a file in existence? Like, consider Stuxnet, right? Stuxnet made its way from the general internet all the way to Iranian centrifuge spinners, right? That's cyber warfare. That's the modern equivalent of burning down the Library of Alexandria. So I'd be very happy to hear your responses to these 3 arguments, or we can move to the next question if you'd prefer.
Quickly. So I think actually climate change is a great example of my point that wealth and technology has put us at a point where we can deal with challenges that our ancestors could never deal with. I think the estimates are that we're going to experience like a 3% loss of GDP by 2100 or something because of climate change. The reason it's only 3% is because GDP is expected to be so big by that point. Not because like 3% of the whole amount is tiny, for an ancient civilization, that would be like everything. But we're going to be so wealthy that, it's only 3% of our stuff. That's fine. We can deal with that. As far as few failure
can I ask you, Sue, why you think the growth is going to continue in perpetuity? Where, for example, if you measured economic growth in 200 AD, you could have just as easily said, as far back as we have data for the last 600 years, we have experienced constant economic and population growth in the Mediterranean. And it would have been exactly the wrong time to make this argument, because a mere 300 years later, the volume of trade would be much lower, urbanization would be much lower, and population density would be much lower.
Yes.
Right. So I think that from the sheer, we cannot take our own projections of economic growth as certainties. Did you know the Soviets had their own measure equivalent to GDP? They did not actually use GDP. They had I think it was total material production factor. And in their own, when their Soviet experts were planning economic growth, they were also expecting to grow all the way to 2010 or 2020. When people make fun of the CIA producing in the 1960s and 70s reports talking about which capacities the Soviet Union will develop in the 2000s, I think we should cut them some slack. They were reading Soviet reports and often taking Soviet reports about themselves at face value.
Interesting. Maybe some evidence is the fact that people are not like liquidating the markets, right? There's very intelligent people who are trying to assess what are the best places to invest my capital. They could just, say, all right, put all my money in gold, put all my money in Bitcoin. But in fact, they're very happy making a bet on the stock market and
Well, look, if Bitcoin is a hedge for disaster, I'm going to note its market cap is vastly higher than it was 5 years ago.
Sure. But I will know that people are not bearish on the stock market, right? And I think that should say something.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a reality there, but I think you have to also agree that there's been a lot of manipulation of the prices of the stock market. The reason I invoke Soviet economic measures, I don't think we're quite at Soviet levels. But let's be honest, when you dump $1 trillion or more from the Fed or the federal government through some other stimulus bill directly into the stock market, or not, indirectly into the stock market, perhaps those numbers are bullish on the value of the stocks themselves as a speculation and not on the underlying value of the companies. It's like if I say radically decrease the value of the US dollar, the price of American stocks valued in US dollars would also go up, wouldn't it? I'm just throwing out some provocations here because my argument here is for we've had a really good run of thinking about our economies for the last 100 years or so, but both the economy has grown more complex and these measures that we crafted like GDP and so on, these are like things from the 1950s and 1960s. And sure, of course, there's been progress in macroeconomics, but there's not been enough progress for us to basically successfully handle financial crises. Like I think 2008 disproves the idea that we have figured out macroeconomic policy well enough to be able to avoid financial crises. And there are more recent crises in Asian countries that, are just as technocratic and, advanced. Like currently, it's a live question whether the Chinese government will be able to manage various Chinese financial challenges well enough to keep their economy on track. There are very serious Western economists asking these questions and Western experts. So I think we have to acknowledge our own limits here. And I can't predict the exact thing we're getting wrong. But if you ask me to say, make a bet and bet with some alien that comes to Earth and the alien is like, Samo, will there be uninterrupted growth in the next 100 years? Or basically uninterrupted, right? I would probably say it's likelier than not. If they say over the next 1,000 years, will there be uninterrupted growth? Then I would say it's likelier no than yes. So I don't know exactly what will happen, but something will interrupt growth at some point.
Sure, and I would agree with that as well. It depends on how intense we think the interruption is going to be.
I think it could be as intense as the fall of the Roman Empire, or as intense as the end of the Han Dynasty in China, to use a non-Western historical example. So I'm talking here about easily 50 or 60 or 80% reduction in like actual wealth, if measured by GDP or something else. Like these are really these tail events that are very infrequent, but when they happen, they can wipe out the accumulated surplus of centuries, right? I really do think that the way I think of economic and social and intellectual progress is that you have a civilizational superstructure, and within this civilizational superstructure, growth continues for a while. Maybe it's an S curve, right? And it becomes stagnant for a very long period of time, the way Egyptian civilization did. Maybe it's like much more dynamic, like let's say Western civilization is, though again, we could make an argument for relative stagnation in the last 50 years. Like books like The Great Stagnation make this case, or a variant of this case. But if the superstructure that's containing this growth, that is supporting it, if that social infrastructure is threatened, collapses, or is displaced from the outside, a lot of that accumulated capital goes to waste.
Right. But do you think that different civilizations are correlated to such an extent that if one collapses, then the other ones are going to collapse as well? I mean, you brought up the example, for example, that we're manufacturing a whole bunch of our electronics in Taiwan. But smartphones haven't even been around for like 20 years, right? So if we fall back like 20 years in terms of
our technological capabilities,
yeah, and we already know here's the idea of a smartphone.
I would ask you, how much does GDP shrink if you lose smartphones right now? I would argue it's more than 3%.
Right, and then so is there, by the way, an alternative metric you would use in order to capture like how well civilization is doing and how fast it's progressing instead of GDP and GDP growth respectively. Because my opinion is, they're imperfect, but I can't think of a better metric to use.
I honestly wish there was a metric that measured institutional health and institutional functionality well. There have been attempts to create things like corruption indexes, sort of like societal health indexes, and they've all been fairly unsuccessful, I have to say. It does seem to me, however, that institutions are similar enough that there should be some quantifiable metric for the quality of an organization. And then honestly, I would just look at a basket of the 500 most important organizations of a society and see how well they're doing. Because I think those organizations together collectively form the superstructure I described, right? The superstructure that's supporting things like a market economy, right? For example, like what do I mean by things that might support a market economy, even though of course they benefit from the market economy as well? Global ocean trade partially rests on there being a great naval power enforcing sort of the laws of the seas. And if a global ocean trade isn't viable, well, maybe land trade is still viable, or maybe smaller seas like the Mediterranean can have it, but you lose so many economies of scale, right? It's a fragmentation back from a global market into local markets. There's an argument to be made, and it's made by so-called system theorists, that we've in fact had a global market since, about the Silk Road era, though not through the Silk Road, rather through the Indian Ocean, tying up with the Mediterranean. During, I think, the Abbasid Caliphate and so on, most of the world's trade passed through the Indian Ocean into the Mediterranean, and from the Mediterranean into the Indian Ocean. The first sort of center of Islamic commerce, of Islamic civilization, was not Baghdad, it was Cairo. And by the way, you might not have known there was a medieval Suez Canal equivalent. There was a canal between the Nile River and the Red Sea. This canal was actually closed by a caliph who wanted to move the center of commerce from Cairo to Baghdad into Mesopotamia. So intentionally made a choice worse for the global economy, but made it a better choke point and much more taxable. That particular dynasty. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there's a lot to say here, right? On the trade example, I feel like the world currently has 1.5 civilizations. I think almost everyone is running. No, really, almost everyone is running kind of a copy of Western civilization, yes. Western industrialized civilization. Even China, let's be honest, Marx and Lenin, these are not Chinese thinkers. Mao might be a Chinese thinker, but the internal structure of the Chinese Communist Party, it's not uniquely Chinese. It's like very similar to the agile early version of the Soviet Communist Party. And the Soviet Communist Party was inspired by the theory and practice of revolutionary parties in Germany. That's where Lenin was educated. So, I think, and when you look at, again, China, it has income tax, it has a police force, it has venture capital funds. Like we can just go through a list of almost every institution you can think of, and it's going to be Western derived. Now, not everything is Western derived. And of course, I'm not saying this all originated in the West. I'm just saying the package came together and everyone's running the same package. If we break down this package, of course, a lot of it will, in medieval era, might go back to the Islamic world or go back to antiquity or go, to Middle Eastern Christianity or, pagan sources or whatever. But we are basically running the same architecture, and we are fairly integrated when it comes to global trade. How many logistical disruptions have we seen because of COVID? I think each of those was a lesson, right? Talking about disasters, I said the Nile River can't disrupt us. Well, what if a fat boat gets stuck in the Suez Canal? That seemed to bother us. That seemed to disrupt us, didn't it? Not enough to collapse civilization, but it was a neat demonstration of how narrow these chokeholds are, how fragile the superstructure of our world order is.
Yeah. I was recently in India for about 2 weeks, and somebody from my family asked me, "So, are you feeling a culture shock?" So, by the way, I grew up in India until I was about 9, and so they said, "Are you feeling a culture shock?" And I said, Not really at all. Like, this is incredibly westernized society. Like, all my cousins, they speak half English, half Gujarati, right? So there's no culture shock at all.
Every summer, when I return to visit family in Slovenia, I marvel at how much more similar Slovenia is to the United States than the year before. Like, consumption patterns are the same. Like, people eat sushi here. That was not the case when I was a kid, for example.
Okay, so just a few rapid fire questions before you go. Since I get to talk to some people who are in the EA progress studies circle, I would like to know, the conventional advice there is, give about like $2,000, $4,000, make the marginal contribution, and then save a person in Africa through malaria bed nets.
If you're thinking about it strategically, you're not necessarily just thinking as a charity giver. You're thinking of yourself as a political actor, as a agent, right? And for most people, probably that's the best way to spend $4,000 or $40,000 or even $400,000. I really doubt that it's the best way for, say, I don't know, like the Patrick Collisons and Sam Altmans of the world to spend their money. I mean, for example, the progress study space, right, very much boosted and launched by a co-authored article between Tyler Cohen and Patrick Collison. A great example of arguably more good was done by them writing that article than donating the amount of money they would have made in that time, to alleviating global poverty directly.
Right. So that was about to be my question, is that if you're of this bent and you have the priorities they do, and if you have access to large amounts of resources, how should you allocate those resources instead of just allocating the same way you would allocate a smaller amount? Because great founder theory, it seems to me, implies that you can have if you can figure out some way to become a live player, then you can probably have a much bigger impact than making marginal contributions.
I mean, I honestly think you should try to spend your money in some ways that are low probability bets that are different from the other low probability bets people are making. If the money your new bespoke foundation was going to spend is going to be spent in the same exact way that the Ford Foundation or the Open Philanthropy Foundation would spend their money, it's probably not spent optimally. Be prepared to waste some of it, but do seek these large wins. Another thing I would propose is often there's no substitute for just building an organization yourself. I think today our view is that once you become very wealthy, the main thing you should do is invest your capital. I would say, no, let other people invest your capital and you continue doing whatever it is that you did best. It's better for Elon Musk to try to, run Tesla or, even a company like the Boring Company or something like this than it is for him to try to become a second Warren Buffett. He's not a Warren Buffett, but he created SpaceX, he created Tesla. I think the best thing he could possibly do is create a new crazy company that costs $100 billion that no one in their right mind would fund except he. And he can make a bet on himself in good conscience. If he spends that money on that new big company, that money doesn't go away. Like, it's been poured back into the economy. Maybe ultimately the company doesn't work out, but not that much wealth has been wasted.
I always like to end my interviews with this question. If great founder theory is true, how should that impact my decisions about what to do in my career?
I think one of the things you should try to do is find a live player and work with them. I mean, whether one can or cannot become a live player, I think there's always room in people's lives for more agency, but it's very difficult. Like, I don't necessarily even think of myself as a live player, right? So I want to make sure that people understand that I have there's a high bar here, right? This isn't a term to use casually. But yeah, I think my advice would be try to work with live players. They will tend to win. Identify the smartest agentic people you can find, make sure that they, match your ethical vision of where the world goes, and then strive to be as useful as you can to them. And you know what? Often that's going to be a very well compensated compliment. And much of my life has also been oriented around trying to make myself useful, both to the public and to live players.
Awesome. Excellent. Samo Burja, thank you so much for coming on this podcast.